Hi guys, I'm going to be doing a lecture on World War I. Yay! So the war was sparked by the assassination of the Archduke, but the underlying causes were nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and public/secret alliances. President Wilson's first reaction was the declaration of U.S. neutrality, and he did this to follow the example of Washington and Jefferson. He found that it was difficult to protect U.S. trading rights and to maintain a policy that favored neither Allied powers or Central powers. The Allied powers were Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman empires of Turkey. President Wilson protested Britain's seizure of American ships by saying it was a violation of the neutral nation's right to freedom of the seas. Germany announced their own blockade that they would sink British ships that entered the war zone with their German submarines, and the Germans sunk a British passenger liner, the Lustiana, in 1915, which killed 128 American passengers. Wilson responded to this with a diplomatic message to Germany as a warning. The Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, thought the message was too warlike, and for this he resigned from the cabinet. 2 more Americans lost their life due to a German submarine attack on a ship named the Arabic, and for this Wilson demanded that no unarmed passenger boats be attacked without a warning first. Germany kept their word on this until March 1916, when a German torpedo hit an unarmed merchant ship, the Sussex, which injured several American passengers. Wilson threatened to cut off U.S. diplomatic relations with Germany entirely. So Germany backed down and replied with the Sussex Pledge, which promised not to sink merchant or passenger ships without warning. The U.S. economy became closely tied with the Allied powers, but still claimed to be neutral. The U.S. trade with the Allies quadrupled, while the trade with Germany fizzled out, and this was between 1914 and 1917. The U.S. permitted loans to the Allies because it promoted the U.S. prosperity, and most Americans' mindset favored Britain and France over Germany. In 1914, immigrants made up about a third of the U.S. population. They were in favor of neutrality, but they would also sympathize with their homeland. For example, an Italian immigrant would favor Italy. Britain commanded the seas and the war news that was being cabled daily to U.S. newspapers and magazines. Republicans from the East, like Theodore Roosevelt, argued for U.S. entry into war against Germany. They wanted to help prepare the military, but Wilson opposed at first and then changed his policy to expand armed forces. Wilson convinced Congress to pass the National Defense Act in June 1916, which also approved the construction of warships as preparedness in case they did go to war. Many Americans, especially in the Midwest and West, were opposed to preparedness because they did not want to go to war at all. Anti-war activists included populists, progressives, and socialists. Roosevelt declined the Progressives Party nomination and rejoined the Republicans, which basically destroyed the Progressive Party altogether. Wilson won the election of 1916, and a month after being reelected, he went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany, which was surprising because before he was saying he was all peace and didn't want any war. Wilson broke off U.S. diplomatic relations with Germany in January 1917, and in March 1917, U.S. newspapers carried the shocking news of a secret offer made by Germany to Mexico. The Zimmerman telegram aroused nationalist anger of Americans and convinced Wilson that Germany fully expected war with the U.S. Wilson wanted the war to be fought for a worthy purpose, like the triumph of democracy. He was bothered that one of the allies was Russia, but all was resolved when Russian revolutionaries overthrew the Tsar's government. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. In April 1917, majority of Congress voted for a declaration of war. Wilson's war government managed to raise $33 billion with a combo of loans and taxes. The Espionage Act of 1917 provided for imprisonment of up to 20 years for people who either tried to incite rebellion in the armed forces or obstruct the operation of the draft. The Sedition Act of 1918 prohibited anyone from making disloyal or abusive remarks about the U.S. government. The Selective Service Act of 1917 was a system to draft men into the military. The government required all men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for possible induction into the military. Almost 400,000 African Americans served in World War I. With all the men enlisting in the war, their jobs became available to women, and there was an increase of migration from Mexicans and African Americans. So in the actual fighting of the war, a revolution in Russia took that nation out of the war completely. Germany concentrated on breaking through Allied lines in France, and their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare was effective as British merchant ships were being sunk at high rates. The U.S. Navy implemented a convoy system of armed escorts for groups of merchant ships. American Expeditionary Force was commanded by General John J. Pershing, and they assumed independent responsibility for the Western Front. On November 11th, 1918, the Germans signed an armistice in which they agreed to surrender their arms, give up a lot of their navy, and evacuate occupied territory. After only a few months of fighting, U.S. combat deaths totaled around 49,000, and after the war completely, the total of U.S. fatalities in World War I were 112,432, which is a lot. Wilson insisted on peace without victory, and he presented a list of war aims, which he called the 14 points. The peace conference took place in the Palace of Versailles. I don't really know how to say that either. Which was outside Paris. The Treaty of Versailles adjourned in June 1919, and what it contained was that Germany was disarmed, the Allies took control of previous German territories, and the signers of the treaty would join a League of Nations, which was President Wilson's idea and it was an international peacekeeping organization. But when he came back to the U.S., he had trouble ratifying the treaty with Congress and senators. Senators who opposed the treaty formed two groups, the Irreconcilables and the Reservationists. In efforts to rally support for the treaty, Wilson had a stroke when he was trying to speak to people and get them to listen to him. He had a stroke from which he never fully recovered, and he ended up leaving office in 1921. After this, the U.S. officially made peace with Germany without signing the Treaty of Versailles. After the war, it was hard for some citizens to adjust economically and socially. Some men weren't able to find jobs right away after leaving to go fight in the war. The business boom of wartime went flat. Farming prices fell, which was hard on farmers. Consumers went on a buying spree, which led to inflation. And in 1921, about 10% of American workforce was unemployed. In 1919, the country began to fear communism, and this was known as the Red Scare. It resulted in restrictions on immigration because of this fear, and this fear is also known as xenophobia. The anti-union attitude softened during the Progressive Era, and factory workers were offered a deal under Theodore Roosevelt. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 protected them from lawsuits, so no one could sue them. In the post-war period, a series of strikes in 1919 turned the public opinion against the union, so that was tough on them. Racial tensions increased because of the Great Migration, which was where African Americans were migrating to northern cities, and all of this was following the war, and that was in the beginning of the 1920s. But during this decade, we will see actually during these 2 decades, we will see a lot of ups and downs in economics and a big cultural boom known as the Roaring Twenties.